can't be displayed. Okay. Interesting. Got Desley Hargraves coming down to meet with me on Monday. Desley Hargraves is coming on Monday to meet with me at Monash. She's coming on
she's
Monday.
Coming, okay.
Yeah.
Get ready for it.
Yeah, have you met her?
Yes, twice on 2 occasions.
What should I expect?
As you know, I love her. Yeah, I don't know what it is, whether it's me or whatever, but she's
As in serious, sort of bureaucratic.
I think she thinks she's a lot better than what she really is.
Oh, okay.
And very bureaucratic.
Yeah. Is she retired or? Okay, so, I mean, it's an interesting, no, it's not, it's an interesting process that Margaret asked me to do it with her because probably philosophically we'd be at opposite ends. Is that just a matter?
I don't know why she did it.
Oh, okay, because Peter Fitzgibbon co-wrote or lead-authored it with her for the other editions, who's presumably pulled out. And my hunch, what she probably said to Margaret, I'm not that confident about doing this on my own. Can you recommend a partner or a collaborator? And Margaret just said, Phil would do it because he knows the area. Anyway, I'll ask.
Yeah, I would have preferred it just to be you.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's probably good that it is with someone who's got a lot of first-hand knowledge of it, because I haven't worked there in 25 years. I mean, I'd be jumping in and saying, well, social workers are working there in a secondary setting. They've got no decision-making power, and the politics are really fascist. And you don't need to say any more. Yeah. And I'd actually question whether there is a positive role for them there, but that probably won't go in the chapter that bluntly. But that's what I'd
that would be your
actually.
Have you had have you got the chapter?
Yeah. I've read both editions, but their chapter in the two earlier editions hardly changed. There was just minor updating.
I know. Yeah. But see, income management has occurred since then, which has been a big.
Yeah, but work for the dole and a whole lot of things that come in between the two editions earlier.
But that wasn't commented on.
No, because they were working.
They were working.
I don't think they could. But, that's why, given she's not working there anymore, that's good, actually.
That could change. Yeah. Okay, good. So I'd be interested. Interested to say. I don't know whether she just doesn't like me. I'm too.
Yeah.
Too but she gets right.
Energized.
Yeah, she's very sort of. And her lectures, like I wouldn't.
Oh, she did.
They're friends, and I just think that I don't think I'll get her back.
Oh, okay.
Like just.
Yeah.
I'm sure we can find someone better.
Yeah. All right.
Anyways, we'll see.
All right.
Where is everyone today? Do you think they're at home finishing off their assignment?
Well, they've only got 3 hours, so they better get moving.
What was he thinking? 12 o'clock on a Wednesday?
Something particular about a Wednesday?
Well, no, I was made at 9 o'clock.
Well, we did make it 9 o'clock originally, and then someone complained very bitterly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, because I think originally Moodle had it up as midnight last night, which is rather weird. Anyway, I moved it to 9 o'clock. Someone asked for clarity. I moved it to 9 o'clock. They complained. I said, well, you did ask for clarity. Anyway, midday. All right. So, people might reasonably have made a judgment that last week's lecture was a particularly significant one in terms of planning the final lecture, and they would be right. But I also find that people often find today's lecture quite important for actually understanding the policy process and what happens and how and why political parties and governments develop policy. So that is pretty much what we'll be taking you through today. I'll be talking for a little while about how political parties develop policy. We'll then cover the Liberal Party and the current Liberal coalition government in great detail, the Liberal Party obviously being currently the dominant political party in Australia and the governing party. We cover that as much as you want or as little as you want. We can do a lot of history, we can do a lot of analysis of the current government led by Malcolm Turnbull, or we can go through it fairly quickly, and depending on how much time we've got, we'll do a bit more small group work at the end, as I'm about to sneeze for the entertainment of the people at home. All right, so as you can see on the handout or on the Moodle, there are two levels for understanding policy. One is the stated intentions of a political party, and the other being their actions, what they actually do when they're in government. Because, of course, if you're in opposition, you can promise the world, but the question is whether you actually deliver in government. If a party is in government, we can judge what they're doing by looking at a whole lot of documents and activities. So every government has an annual budget. That comes at a different period of the year depending on whether it's a state government or a federal government. The federal budget is generally in June. The state budget I think might be in May, so that will vary. Even so, policies can change during the year because the government may say we're planning to do A, B, C and D, and then there is a world financial crisis and the amount of revenue they expect to get falls dramatically during that period, so they have to revise their budget estimates and what they've got to spend. So there can be variations, and also there can be unanticipated consequences of particular actions. It's always good to look at a policy statement by a political party or government because it will set out in a fair bit of detail the desirable situation that they would like to see exist now or in the future. A policy statement may go a bit further to a goal statement. It may set out specific objectives, what the party intends to do or the government intends to do for that next year, how much it intends to spend and so on. And if you look at any government budget document, there will generally be a fair bit of detail, particularly at a Commonwealth level, about income security, because as we all know, the current Commonwealth government is spending now over $150 billion a year on income security, $150 billion. So that is a figure the current government are very worried about because they're projecting that figure will rise to about $270 billion a year by 2020. Policy statements can also involve a statement of belief or philosophy or principles, and if you were to go back to the 1980s particularly, the Australian Labor Party that was then in government for a 13-year period at the Commonwealth level issued annual social justice statements which basically said we as a party believe in social justice and these are the policies we're going to implement to achieve that. So they attempted anyway to link their particular policies to a broader philosophical goal. In more recent decades, the Labor Party or governments have tended to talk more about social inclusion, not social justice. Interestingly, coalition governments, which I would tag as being very ideological, very much driven by what we call neoliberal philosophy, tend not to mention philosophy so much, if at all, in their policy statements, although they will talk about having a commitment to the free market. But they often attempt to claim, well, do claim, that basically they're representing the national interest and not some particular philosophy or ideology. Any comments so far or questions? No? Okay. Well, what does the political policy say? There are probably about three main features which you've got up there. A policy statement will tend to have a glossy cover with a sober and conservative presentation and typeface featuring the party's logo. So they aim to give you something that has an image of needing to be taken seriously. Now, some of you are probably old enough to remember the Work Choices booklet, which this was in about 2005, which got delivered to every household in Australia. Didn't do them much good, though. It almost certainly cost them the 2007 election, but that was a good example. Secondly, policy statements will tend to analyse the current state of affairs. So if it's a statement by the government of the day, they will basically say what a mess the other party got us into when they were in government, and all the hard work we're going to have to do to fix that mess up in the next period of government. And the really, really, really dire consequences if we let that other party have another go at government. As we know, elections are getting even more combative. I don't follow the American elections in a lot of detail. I find it rather, I don't know what the word is, negative to put it mildly, but I know some people have probably been watching the Clinton-Trump debates. A few people here, yeah, a bit hard to ignore it. And it just seems to be massively personal. It's not even party political there. It's just like, I don't like you, you're a bad person, yeah, you're a bad person too. Let alone any serious debate about the policies. It's just ridiculously narrow, superficial, but that increasingly is what we're getting. And policy statements by opposition, yeah, in Australia it just says, yeah, the government's terrible, and, you know, the world will fall apart tomorrow if you re-elect them type thing. We don't really get serious policy debates anymore, even at election time, like we might have 20 years ago. The third component is policy statements very much try to promote or project a desirable state of affairs in the future. So that might be where they put forward a grand plan for regenerating Australia, reconstructing the economy, driving us forward into the 22nd century, whatever. Or it might be some more micro practical objectives from which you need to deduce the grand plan, if there actually is any grand plan. So yep. Should you be concerned? Oh, it absolutely will be biased. There's, yeah, and I guess what I'm saying increasingly is that party statements in Australia are getting probably more and more disingenuous and less honest, because instead of the party saying this is what we believe in philosophically, you know, support us if you agree with that or don't if you don't, it tends to mainly be filled with attacks on the other party. And there are a whole lot of reasons for that. Obviously, the 24-hour media is impacted, the social media is impacted, so everybody's under more pressure to deliver what you might call sound bites rather than serious policy discussion. But again, it's about the convergence of the two main parties, so the differences between the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are so less significant than they were 30 years ago. But yeah, the parties, particularly at election time, a lot of it is not very trustworthy, what they will tell you. How do political parties make policies? That is an interesting thing. The two main parties have got quite different policy traditions. They've both got policy committees. So by policy committees, I mean internal party committees where members of the party will be elected. So there would be a foreign policy committee, a human services committee, a defence committee, sports committee, and so on. The Labor Party process tends to be relatively democratic and participatory, and I was a member of the Labor Party Human Services Committee. I think that was what it was called in about the mid-90s mid to late 90s for a few years, and that was a fairly open process where you nominated that you wanted to be on the committee. There would be a meeting about once every month at the Labor Party headquarters in Carlton. You would go along, you would put a point of view. If you had a particular area of interest, like child welfare for myself, you would have more input into that. And eventually, two other people and myself and the then Shadow Minister, Christine Campbell, who later became the Minister in the state Labor government, wrote the party policy for the 1999 election on child welfare, which was an election, mind you, that the state Labor Party didn't expect to win, but they did. So they suddenly were in government not really knowing what they intended to do. Anyway, so that was an experience. I left the party soon after. I haven't rejoined any political party since then for a whole range of reasons. I think sometimes as an academic it's better to be independent of any political parties, but that's another matter. But would encourage you to join if you're interested. Any few members of political parties, by the way? Nobody? It's really interesting because when I did social work 30 years ago, I reckon probably a third of the students were active in political parties. Yeah.
How many were in the Liberal Party? Not many.
I don't think any. And some of them would have been in parties to the left of the Labor Party. Yeah. But a lot of social workers are members of the Greens, I believe. Their candidate in the seat of in the area of Northcote in the last federal election, Alex Buthow, is I think runs the ASW Greens Social Work Committee, and she actually went very close to getting elected against David Feeney. There have been quite a few social workers in Parliament actually, and Richard Wynne, Dick Wynne, who's the current minister in the state Labor government, has a social work background. Yeah. Anyway, getting off topic a little bit. The Liberal Party, they also have policy committees, but the influence of their members of parliament tends to be a bit stronger. So if you were to lobby the Liberal Party on a particular issue, for example, say, income security issue, you'd probably be talking more to the minister or their staffers rather than bothering with internal policy committees. The Greens, I believe, are very democratic. I think probably because of their smaller membership, although they do have a very active membership, anybody that joins the party can probably participate quite actively in any areas that they want to contribute to. The language and tradition of political parties, again, that is quite unique. Where are we? As we know, historically the Labor and Liberal parties have had very big differences in their philosophy. So the Liberal Party have always emphasised individualism, smaller government, less government intervention generally. The Labor Party, in contrast, have been more concerned with collectivist approaches and the responsibility of government to protect the well-being of all citizens, particularly those that are less affluent. Labor Party also generally have been more inclined to look at societal explanations for the causes of social problems and potential solutions. That has changed a lot, though, in the last 30 years. As we said earlier, the parties have increasingly converged. They've increasingly become more and more similar. The Labor Party has definitely moved towards the Liberal Party, not the other way. If anything, the Liberal Party have probably gone further to the right. So there are still differences in social welfare policy, as we'll talk about in more detail today and next week, but the differences arguably remain one of degree only. So there are no major differences in terms of, say, the amount of money overall that those two parties would like to spend on income security. If there are differences at the budget level, it would be at the edges. But there will still be some differences about what programs should be given priority, what particular groups of people should be supported or not supported, and that type of thing. So, questions, comments? Yeah, good question. Look, it probably happened. I'm actually writing a history of the Australian welfare state at the moment from 1972. I haven't started writing, but I've started researching, and it's really interesting to analyse what you're asking. I think it happened around 1980, 81, when the Labor Party was still in opposition, but they began amending their approach from a very supportive approach to a less sympathetic approach. They actually did go to the 1983 election, which they won, with what we would call quite social democratic policies, particularly around the accord with the trade union movement and income security. And then the minute they got elected, the new government under Prime Minister Hawke said the budget deficit that the bad Liberal national government has left us is much, much higher than we anticipated. We are very badly in debt. We have much less money to spend than we thought we would. Consequently, we are going to have to radically amend the policies that we promised to implement. So from that point on, that government, which ended up in government for 13 years till 1996, pursued really what we would call neoliberal policies with a bit of a human edge, a bit of a sympathetic edge, but at the end of the day, all the rhetoric from that government was about getting the economy right as a priority. And okay, once we get the economy right, then we can help the people who are struggling. And they did implement some serious reforms to help low-income people, particularly single parents with children, who got major increases in their payments during that period. But again, it was something more at the margins rather than at the centre of their governing agenda. Yeah. All right. Now, I can talk about the Liberal Party for an hour or more, or we can cut it down to 20, 30 minutes, or what do people prefer? Just sort of go through it and you interrupt or ask questions as you want. Yeah, okay. I mean, a lot of it is in Chapter 5 of Australia's Welfare Wars anyway, other than the more recent material on the Turnbull government. So, I mean, the Liberal Party traditionally were a party of pragmatic conservatism, blending a number of different philosophies. And there were sort of three philosophies, but the first one was what we call a social liberal tendency, which, as we've said in earlier classes, was about protecting the underprivileged through state intervention, and often quite a sympathetic philosophy, not really that different in practice to social democracy. The second philosophy was what we call neoliberalism, which very much focuses on the free market and individuals, and that has become completely dominant in the Liberal Party today, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. The third philosophy, which is ongoing, is what we call social conservatism, and that is really about defending traditional conservative symbols like the monarchy, like the nuclear family. It also comes out on issues like abortion, euthanasia, and other social issues. So we see with the current same-sex marriage debate that social conservative philosophy is very influential in the governing Liberal National Party coalition. That is why a plebiscite was proposed rather than a parliamentary vote. So you're all aware, presumably, that they were proposing a plebiscite where everybody in the country would vote, yes or no to same-sex marriage, which would have cost a lot of money. It looks like it won't happen now because they have to pass the plebiscite bill in Parliament, and the Labor Party has said they'll oppose it, so it probably won't get through. The alternative was simply to have a vote in in Parliament, which would obviously be a lot cheaper and a lot quicker. Can anybody got an idea why they didn't want a parliamentary vote, the government?
Because the Conservatives sort of passed Parliament. They know that there's enough members of their own party, maybe smaller Liberals, not to mention the Greens and Labor, already supported them.
Could be true, yep. So the Conservatives in the coalition thought better to put it to a plebiscite than we or whoever can campaign against it, and there is a history in Australia that plebiscites or referendums rarely win. I don't know if you're aware of that. So yeah, that could be one explanation. Anybody else want to hazard a guess?
Do people know the difference between plebiscite and referendum?
Is there a major difference, Simone?
I don't think it's changed there much the same, except the fact that the plebiscite slightly shifts responsibility away from the government actually having to make a decision about it. Opinion, not fact.
The referendums are only for changes in the Constitution, whereas plebiscites are merely a massive opinion poll.
I think you're right. Well done. Well, my hunch is that the government was so divided on the issue that they believed if it got put to a parliamentary vote, they would be riven by division and look like they had no idea what they were doing, because clearly the Prime Minister supports same-sex marriage and clearly Tony Abbott and his cohorts don't. So I think they saw that as, you know, an alternative to avoid the government being divided badly by the issue. But anyway, it will be interesting to see where it ends up. So these sort of views anyway were, I guess, blended within the party historically. And Sir Robert Menzies was the famous leader of the Liberal Party and indeed the Prime Minister from 1949 to 1965, so the longest serving ever Prime Minister in Australia. If any of you are watching A Place Called Home on Showcase, any of you watch that series? Nobody? It's absolutely brilliant. You should watch it if you're not. Australian drama actually features Sir Robert Menzies in it, playing a minor role. Well, not him, obviously he's dead, but somebody pretending to be him. So his governments were very much symbolised by that compromise on the one hand between individual freedom, market freedom, and on the other hand a belief that government should provide support for the poor. So that was prevalent throughout that period he was Prime Minister, although I might add that the governments of that period, the Australian governments of that period, were very frugal. By frugal I mean careful, not particularly generous in the amount of money they spent on the poor, and in fact Australia, until about 1973, was one of the lowest spenders in the OECD. In terms of social welfare, we were well below other similar countries in the Western world. So I think there was a famous statement by Prime Minister John Gorton, who was one of the coalition Prime Ministers not long after Menzies retired in 1969, who said that Australia was very generous in supporting the poor because every poor person in Australia had a roof over their head and a blanket at night. The Fraser government, coalition government from 1975 to 83, reflected similar ideals, similar compromises, if you like, between supporting the poor but at the same time wanting to ensure that people on income security had what they called adequate incentives for self-reliance. And of course, self-reliance is a term that still keeps coming up very regularly from the current government, and that is the term that very much correlates with neoliberal beliefs. So that's a little bit of history. It's certainly up till 1983. Any questions so far? No? We'll keep racing along. So what happened in 1983, or what has happened since 1983, is the Liberal Party has basically been taken over by neoliberal ideas of small government and the free market. So these were ideas that historically were called classical liberalism, and it means that the social liberal faction that we talked about earlier has been completely marginalised. So I can't think of virtually anybody in the current federal parliamentary party who has a commitment to that social liberal tradition. There may be some members of parliament, in fact there's probably a few who are liberal on social issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, euthanasia, but on income security, it is very rare now to hear of anybody in the Parliamentary Liberal Party dissenting from the dominant view. And there are often parliamentary inquiries, as you know, either in the Senate or House of Reps into issues like income management and so on. and those committees include people who are not ministers in the government. They include people that are backbenchers, but again, those inquiries generally completely endorse current government policy. There is very little, if any, dissent. Why did the Liberal Party move around 1983 to the neoliberal position? There were probably three main factors. One was what we call the worldwide crisis of the welfare state. I don't know if any of you have heard about that before. So what really happened was that around the mid-1970s, traditional Keynesian methods stopped working. Keynesian, have we talked about John Maynard Keynes before? K-E-Y-N-E-S. So John Maynard Keynes was an economist who in the 1930s and 40s promoted the view that governments needed to intervene in the economy to achieve a balance in the economy, particularly following the Great Depression of the 1930s, where virtually all the Western economies went down the toilet and there was mass unemployment and mass poverty, and that of course contributed to the rise of extreme philosophies like Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, and communism in some other countries. So Keynes' view became the dominant view throughout the Western world from the end of the Second World War. So from 1945 to about 1974, most Western economies had what we call full employment. And the view of Keynes was that if the economy stopped growing, if it fell into negative growth, if the government spent more, that would then lift the growth and get full employment back. But if inflation, if the prices of things that you buy jumped too quickly, then the government would lower spending, and then that would reduce inflation, but it might increase unemployment a bit more. So basically the idea was that there was a trade-off between inflation and employment, and governments could easily sort of manipulate the economy a little bit one way or a little bit the other way according to the way things were going. Suddenly in the mid-1970s that stopped working, and most economies around the world got both high inflation and high unemployment. And those of you who studied economics in an early degree would be aware that that situation got called stagflation. Any of you heard of stagflation? Anyway, there were a whole lot of other issues happening at the time. The oil crisis as well, where the major oil producing countries, mainly in the Middle East, spiralled their oil prices, which meant that Western economies or Western governments were having to pay much bigger amounts for oil, for petrol and so on, which obviously impacted on inflation. So governments were finding they could no longer control the economy, and because unemployment was shooting up, a lot more people were on income security payments, which was affecting their revenue, which meant that they were falling into deficit and so on. So in that situation there was a loss of confidence in those traditional Keynesian methods of government intervention. The second factor, at the same time, there was this international revival of these very old classical liberal beliefs, which had become famous through Adam Smith, an 18th century philosopher who you may have heard of, then through Friedrich Hayek, H-A-Y-E-K, a famous Austrian theorist in the 1930s and 40s mainly, who wrote a very famous book called The Road to Serfdom, which basically said if governments intervene in the economy, we'll all end up with totalitarian communist regimes. And then an American economist, Milton Friedman, who wrote a very famous book in the 1960s called Freedom to Choose. So these ideas, these classical liberal or neoliberal ideas, which had been completely marginal from about 1940 to about 1972, which were basically considered quite ratbaggery, suddenly came back to the political centre in the mid-1970s. And governments were elected in America under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, a Republican president from 1980, I think, till 1988. And in Britain, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Party, she was Prime Minister from about 79 to 91, I think. And the fact that they were elected while promoting these ideas suggested that not only the ideas were relevant, but that they were popular. The third factor, as I said earlier, was that the Labor Party, which held government for that long 13-year period from 83 to 1996, moved to the political centre, which meant that the then Liberal Party thought, we've got to move further to the right to show that we're actually different to the Labor Party. So they were the three main factors which sent the Liberal Party onto a neoliberal agenda, and which meant that that older social liberal idea of compassion for the poor got pretty much marginalised. Questions, comments?
Just on the issue of that neoliberal agenda, I was reading some pieces recently which suggested there might be a bit of a crisis with general perception in, for instance, the 80s that the economic model was the way to increase global wealth and prosperity, and in particular since the 2008 crisis, it started to be increasingly more and more questioned, although of course, as it's still dominant, most people don't even know the word neoliberal, let alone what it means. It's probably a long way off from the crisis that Keynesian economics encountered in the 70s. I'm just wondering if the left has generated an economic model which can be used as a counter to neoliberalism in the same way that Hayek and Friedman and other zealots of that particular cause went about establishing policy think tanks to really be promoting this and pushing this at around the same time. Has there been a similar emergence of an economic model from the left?
It's a really, really good question, and the simple answer is no. The left has hit a complete dead end because the other factor that really impacted was the end of communism in the Soviet Union. And I guess while the Soviet Union still existed as a very powerful state, which pretty much controlled all of Eastern Europe and much of Central Europe, there was, if you like, a implied threat to capitalism in the West, which said, if you implement policies that are too tough on working class people and poor people, then they may rise up and threaten you with communism as an alternative. So governments, even of conservative political parties, were always mindful that they needed to ensure that things didn't get too rough or too tough for people at the bottom, because otherwise there were radical alternatives out there. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the sense that there might be some alternative economic or political model to free market capitalism also collapsed. So the social democratic, the moderate left, as in the Labor Party here or the Labor Party in Britain, have been flailing around, if you like, ever since that period, trying to find an alternative because they don't have one. And a lot of people that are not in politics think that they need to be looking more at local communities and getting back to the sense of what the welfare state originally was meant to do, which was to give some sort of agency and choice to people that were disadvantaged, and give them an opportunity to participate, particularly in their local communities, and for some sort of solidarity, if you like, to develop between people that were more advantaged and people that were less advantaged in their own communities, so that people wouldn't be left alone and isolated when they were doing it hard. But that is not something that either the Labor Party have done much about or most social democratic parties around the world have done much about. There is a little bit of impetus around the world at the moment for what is called a guaranteed minimum income. And that is not a new idea. It's actually been around for at least 50 years or more. And ironically, one of the strongest advocates of a GMI was Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, because his view, as with many left-wing libertarians, was that we spend so much money and so much resources running around assessing whether people are eligible, monitoring them, surveilling them, breaching them, blaming them, making sure they comply, whatever you like, so that so much of the spending in that area goes to bureaucrats, not to the actual people we're claiming to help. The Labor Party government in the mid-1970s under Gough Whitlam actually formally at one point announced they would introduce the GMI as an outcome of the inquiry into poverty led by Professor Ronald Henderson, but then after a lot of debate in 1975 they shelved the idea. There's a whole lot of reports on that which you could read. You'd probably find them in the Monash Library. But I think the basic decision was it was unrealistic, too difficult from a process point of view. But in the last few years, it has come back on the agenda, particularly in Europe and in other parts of the world. I think might be parts of Africa or India, there has been some GMI pilot projects, and there are a lot more people talking about it now than there were 5 years ago. I think it probably will never happen on a national or scale, let alone a global scale, but I think certainly in areas that are particularly disadvantaged, it might be some of the areas where we've got compulsory income management, where there is so many people that are living in dire conditions. This is something that might be looked at, on a smaller scale, because clearly current policies are not working. But I think the thing with the GMI always is, are you just going to put people on a guaranteed minimum income and throw the keys away, so to speak, and say, well, go off and live on that income, which would still be a low income. It might just be a little bit higher than the current payments. Or do you say, well, yes, we'll introduce a GMI for everybody on income security living in Shepparton or Bendigo, but as part of that, we're going to introduce local community committees that actually work with these people and help them, and even if they can't find them paid work, give them something to participate in, to be part of, so that they're part of the community and they're not on their own and just left to their own fate. But all these things need resources and money, but again, the question would be, are all the resources we're putting into compliance and other areas, work for the dole or whatever they're calling it now, are they of any value, and would we be better off actually concentrating resources on supporting the people that we claim need the resources? But yeah, alternative economic model, nothing. Well, it could, and it goes both ways. And of course, in Britain with Brexit, in America with Trump, in some other countries, Pauline Hanson in Australia, we've seen what you might call a right-wing fringe backlash, but then in Greece, of course, you had a left-wing backlash to the point where a party that in Australia would be considered far left actually won government. But the outcome there was interesting because that far left-wing party has had to adhere at the end of the day to the financial discipline of the European Union, or they could leave the EU like Britain have voted to, but they haven't chosen to at the moment. So there is a backlash. I don't think what has happened is new, because it really, once globalisation hit, which happened probably around the time of the fall of communism, and particularly with the rise of the internet and the ease now with which financial transactions occur, and the ease of, you know, buying property or businesses in another country or whatever, that is very different to the pre-social media era. There's no doubt that in virtually throughout the Western world, a lot of the old industries have collapsed. The old opportunities for blue-collar work in manufacturing industries have collapsed. So a lot of opportunities that would have been there 30, 40 years ago for people to have jobs that they probably would have held all their life have gone. So that backlash, that anger is not new. It's probably 20, 25, even 30 years old. But there is no clear, viable alternative, number one. And number two, the dominant powers within America and the Western world have not moved from that free market position, not moved one little bit. So, you know, until I think we actually have governments that are elected and say we're going to do something quite different. I mean, it's interesting that Bernie Sanders was a very major candidate for the Democrats in America. He didn't win the candidacy, but he went pretty close, who was clearly putting forward an alternative. I mean, in American context, it was a very radical alternative. In Australia, it would have been something that you would have expected, say, from a leader of the left faction of the Labor Party. Not particularly radical or exciting, but certainly still something a bit different to what the Turnbull government is pushing. But I just don't see anyone coming up with a serious model to attract those isolated or angry people. So, you know, wait and see. In 10 years it might be different. Bob.
Just a couple of comments. Just in historical terms, that early 1970 period when you talk about Keynesian economics stopping working, I haven't actually put the two thoughts together, but the other thing that happened there that had a major impact on global trade was actually the arrival of containers. Containers only arrived in 71, 72, and that the effect of that was just massive. It just changed global trade totally. At a time when we had the oil crisis, and governments simply, like protectionism, the cost of transport and protectionism became very, very expensive. And so that, you know, and the other thing that happened was the size of shipping. Because of the price of oil, they started building, like an oil tanker went from 100,000 tonnes to 300,000 triple. And these container ships, like a cargo ship might have had 20, 30,000 tonnes. They went to 80 and they're stacked with containers. They weren't unloaded manually. So just say 2 or 3 years ago, $1,000 television could be transported here from the middle of China for $10. So you can build anywhere, you can manufacture anywhere, partly because of the cost of transport of containerisation is very significant. And enabler, if you like.
Well, I guess that's a good point, which really reinforces the fact that globalisation is here to stay, and a lot of the movements that have emerged, the angry movements, the Brexit and so on, are anti-globalisation, but globalisation will not stop. But globalisation as it currently exists tends to be very unequal and unfair. and that is the issue. But of course, for all the people in the Western world who are complaining about globalisation being unfair to them because maybe they can't get the jobs they traditionally had been able to access, there are of course more and much bigger numbers of people in the developing world who are working but maybe hardly being paid enough money to eat. So globalisation is unstoppable, but it can be transformed into a much more equitable process, but that will take time. And certainly the Brexit and the other movements, they're not campaigning for that. They're just saying we don't want to lose our jobs to other countries. Well, maybe we'll have a break there and we'll come back and we'll just go through the Liberal Party critique of welfare a little bit and then perhaps do some small group work.
Look, unless they're absolute wonders, I'm pretty sure what we can do is just get them to get done.
But, you know, I think particularly for the first test where she fairly blunt in her feedback is
Yeah.
to just
Today, yeah. And they become, they've got to have more seller to go to make sure that they go. But yeah, this is not a bad group for next year's group. I worry
Okay, where were we? If I can get this. So I think what we might do is just take you quickly through the Liberal Party critique of welfare, which, as you're probably aware, basically correlates with the neoliberal critique of welfare that we talked about at length. I think we talked about at length in an earlier class. Might have been week 2, or maybe that was a Moodle class. So the first aspect of that critique, and again this is all in Chapter 5 of Australia's Welfare Wars, is the interest group capture of the welfare state, which essentially their view is that pressure groups, lobby groups, interest groups, whatever term you want to use, capture the welfare state and use it for their own advantage. Generally, social workers are targeted as a particular group in that argument, that they're basically pimps of the poor. You've probably heard that term before, pimps of the poor. So there's been this history in the Liberal Party of suddenly attacking the welfare sector, and in 1991 the then leader of the Liberal Party, John Hewson, H-E-W-S-O-N, who was the candidate in the 1993 election against Prime Minister Paul Keating, the unsuccessful candidate. He gave a very famous speech in 1991 to the Australian Council of Social Service, the peak welfare lobby group ACOS, where he said, if I'm elected, I will cut off all your government funding, because in our view you're basically just concerned with building welfare empires. You've got no concern for the poor that you claim to represent. So that's been a bit of an ongoing view of the Liberal Party, although they've toned that down a little bit since Hewson, because certainly during the Howard government, the view of Prime Minister Howard was that he wanted to work with the welfare sector to co-opt them into implementing his agenda, but he chose very carefully which groups in the welfare sector he wanted to work with, and they were basically church-based groups like Mission Australia, then headed by Patrick McClure, who of course ended up being appointed not only by the Howard government to chair the Welfare Reform Inquiry in 2000, but then again by Tony Abbott to chair the new Welfare Reform Inquiry in 2014. So the Howard government sort of said, well, you know, we're not going to defund ACOS, but we're just pretty much going to marginalise them and not talk to them that much. But groups like Mission Australia and other church-based groups are the ones we want to work with, because they're less ideological and supposedly more concerned just with helping the poor. So that's part 1. Part 2 is about labour market reform, which of course is not technically welfare policy, but it correlates very closely with welfare policy. And the view of the Liberal Party long-standing has been that minimum wages should be cut. They claim they are too high because they are, I forget the latest rate, but I think they're still at about 48% of the average wage, which is a fair bit lower than they were 20 years ago, but it's still quite a bit higher than many other Western countries. But of course in Australia the minimum wage has historically been used basically as the main welfare intervention, if you like, because the Australian welfare state was historically called a wage earners welfare state, which reflected the fact that the minimum wage essentially was used to ensure that low-income people had an income above the poverty line, and welfare was seen as a minor issue. Of course, it is no longer a minor issue. Again, as I said earlier, we spend $150 billion a year on it. But the Liberal Party essentially have an agenda of trying to drive down the minimum wage. And then, of course, if the minimum wage got cut, what do you think would happen to income security payments? No, they would
cut even more, because the
The amount of people, the amount of people claiming increase.
that could quite likely happen. You're quite right, because a lot of people would probably think, well, if you're only going to pay me a small amount of money to work, I might as well not work. But then the government would say, well, we're going to give you an incentive to work because we're going to cut welfare even more because we don't want you having an incentive not to work. So that was pretty much what happened in 2005. The government introduced work choices, which was designed to reduce wages and working conditions, particularly for lower income workers. And at the same time, they introduced the Welfare to Work Bill, which cut the incomes of new applicants for sole parent pension or disability support pension. So they were pretty much saying, okay, we're going to try and cut the minimum wage, and then if you choose not to work, we're going to cut your benefit as well so that you have an incentive to work even at a much lower rate than before. So it's a bit of a double-pronged strategy, and they always go together, those two issues. Welfare dependency is something you will hear a lot about from current government ministers, the belief that government welfare can may discourage self-reliance, and in contrast, the aim of programs should be to encourage people to rely on themselves or their family or non-government agencies, not on government. So when governments say, as the Minister Christian Porter has said in the last few weeks, we want to give individuals support to become more self-reliant. There seems to be this view that people are in some way addicted to welfare in the same way that a person might be addicted to drugs or alcohol or gambling or pornography. There is no empirical evidence at all that people are addicted to welfare or there is any such condition, psychological or otherwise, but this has been a long-standing neoliberal argument that people become dependent on welfare in some sort of psychological way. Fourthly, the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. The belief that some people are genuinely needy because of no fault of their own, due to illness or trauma or something, but on the other hand, the belief that a lot of people are undeserving, that they are unemployed because they choose to be, they really don't want to work, they are lazy, they are immoral, or they are on the sole parent pension because they choose to have children with 5 different dads and make a career out of it. And you might have heard the term welfare queen, which has been particularly prominent in America in the past, but also a little bit here, the belief that a lot of sole parents make a career out of being a sole parent. So again, that has been a strong argument of Liberal National Coalition governments that we need to clear out the people that are undeserving. And the final argument or critique is about privatising welfare. And ideally, many people in the Liberal Party believe that we should revert to a more charitable non-government provision of income security rather than it being provided by government. I guess, and that is reflected a little bit in Job Services Australia, the privatised employment services which were introduced by the Howard government in 1998. But yeah, ideally the government would prefer that the Salvation Army or St Vincent de Paul or some other charity were providing income security, not the government, and that they were doing that on a conditional basis where they would interview people individually and make a judgment about whether they were deserving or not. So that is pretty much the Liberal Party critique of the welfare state. Questions or comments?
I just want to point out more.
Yep.
There's a double whammy, I think, in the sense that it's not only the wage-based person and the hours work, so that not only being paid well, I mean, if you work a lot of hours, you get at least sufficient to survive. But because the definition of unemployment is so, well, it's been twisted to reduce the numbers. So if you work a few hours a week, you're still employed. You multiply that by the rate, and just can't subsist.
That's a very good point, and I don't know if you've ever heard the term poverty traps. Poverty traps exist because many people who are unemployed do work every week, and sometimes they work a small amount of hours, sometimes they work a lot more hours, but for every hour they work, they lose a very high proportion of that wage in benefits. So, you know, if they work 20 hours a week, they may lose virtually all their unemployment payment, their New Start allowance for that week, which means that people don't have much incentive to work longer hours, and that's been an ongoing problem, which governments have promised to deal with but have never addressed in Australia anyway. So people get caught in that trap of ongoing casual work plus New Start allowance, but never really significantly improving their actual take-home money, unless they can find full-time ongoing work. Yep. All right. Well, I don't know if you wanted to hear anything more about the current government. Do people have any particular questions about the policies of the current Turnbull-led government?
I guess I'm just curious that with Porter's announcement that we're adopting the New Zealand style of welfare state, practically speaking, what kind of changes could we expect if that policy actually goes through?
Well, the policy has gone through. It's I think I've just dropped my recording, but it's not a policy they need to put up for a vote in Parliament, because at the moment all they're doing is they've announced a $96 million fund, which of course sounds very generous, to invest in supporting people to move from welfare to work, and particularly targeting three groups who a report by, I think it was by Price Waterhouse, which you can find on the internet, identified as being at particular risk of long-term welfare reliance. They were young carers, so that could be a young person who's caring for a sick parent or a sick sibling. It could be a young parent, somebody who's had a child at a very young age, or it could be a student. Apparently you are one of those groups, most at risk of long-term ripping off the taxpayer. So it will be interesting to see. As some of you know, I'm giving a talk not this Thursday, but Thursday weeknight on the 20th of October in St Kilda, so I'm going to say a little bit about that very policy. But look, I don't think it will have much of an impact at all, because it's pretty much a side issue. You can try and help people who are struggling individually, but it's not really going to impact unless you provide ongoing support in a serious way. And the fact is, if people are looking like they're going to be long-term reliant on income security, that probably reflects some fairly significant factors about the opportunities they've had, their family background, the schools and education they've had or they've lacked. If they're already at risk, you know, and they might have grown up in out-of-home care or come here as refugees, if they're in that situation, they're going to require a lot of support to move into work or move into the mainstream. And it would be in the best interests of the government economically and socially to provide that support. But the fact is that the current system mostly doesn't provide it. That's where the issue again of the community comes in. Do we find a role? Do we fund a role for local community groups and communities to support people who are doing it hard and to give them opportunities, and which involves relationship support as well as just saying here's some training to do that might get you a job, even though you're depressed and you're homeless and various other factors. So, you know, the New Zealand people have been doing the sums and saying it's saving them, you know, millions and billions of dollars. Well, it might be saving them in one area, but they might be spending the same amount of money or more in another area. Because if you think you're just going to move people from welfare to work and they're going to be better off, all the evidence from similar programs around the world says they don't actually end up better off necessarily, because you can be poor and really struggling on welfare, but you might still be poor and struggling not on welfare. If you get a job, is it a full-time job? Is it a livable income? A whole lot of questions there. So I think it'll probably be one of these things that in 3 or 4 years we'll hear very little more about. But if some people get help, that's good. But there's probably better ways of going about it that might be more effective in the long run. Any other comments? No? Okay, well maybe we'll have a go at the small group work. So, as in earlier weeks, we've got a group of quotes for you. And as in earlier weeks, it's not a right or wrong answer, it's a matter of having a go and trying to work out which ideology or philosophy is reflected in the quote. So I'll break you into some groups. So perhaps if the 5 people here in this front row could do Sir Robert Menzies. If the people in the next row, 4 of you plus JJ, you might like to move, if you could do John Gorton. The next one after that is Malcolm Fraser, so the 4 of you in that next row. We've then got John Howard, so the 4 of you in that second back row. And then we've got John Hewson, the 4 of you in that very back row. So how about we give you a bit over 10 minutes to work on that one, and if you finish quicker than that, you could have a go at some of the others as well if you'd like. So you might want to move so you're next to the people in your group. going. Have we all finished? So, which group would like to begin?
So
You're doing John Gorton?
we are indeed.
Beautiful.
So we were kind of tossing up between social liberal and more welfare position. We're certain that it's a residualist position because he's limiting it twice. He's not only talking about those who are. He's not only talking about limiting the state intervention to only those who are very poor and have no one there to serve them, but even more so because it's specifically to do with pensioners. So it's certainly a residualist position, probably more in line with welfare because he does.
What do you mean by
Oh,
welfare?
sorry, welfarism.
Welfarism?
Yeah. So as in like because it's that specific focus on only helping the underprivileged and those who can't help themselves, and those who can't help themselves, so that they come so far that they don't have those traditional supports in place that would otherwise be there to help them.
Okay. So why would you not call it a neoliberal position?
Well, we considered that, and we did say that it was quite a strong influencer on it.
It can be neoliberal in the term that it's limiting government intervention, because they have clearly mentioned like what a particular, to what extent it should be supporting through those people through government intervention. In that case, it can be considered neoliberalism. But at the same time, like it's not entirely restricting the state interventions. It's asking it to an extent. In that case, it's definitely an example of classical liberalism.
An example of?
Classical liberalism.
Yeah, which is the same as neoliberalism. Okay, does anyone else want to comment from the other groups? John Gordon, Bob says, was a unique person. Of course he was, because John Gordon had half his face blown off during World War II in combat, so he was a rather unusual looking person. But was actually very well regarded and quite respected by the Australian public, but not by his own party. And he ended up being overthrown by William McMahon, who then became Prime Minister and succeeded him, who had very big ears, if you ever look at a photo. And he married Sonia, who became Sonia McMahon, who was a lot younger than him, and she famously wore a dress with a very low cut to a public event, I think in about 1970, and was remembered after always for the dress, which is a bit by and by. But when he made that comment in 1969, it was seen as a sort of very uncompassionate comment, as expressing a view that, oh yeah, there's really no poverty in Australia, and yeah, anybody who is getting a payment has got a roof and a blanket. And the reality was that there was quite extreme poverty in those days, but it was poverty that was reflected in particular areas and particular groups more so than today. But I certainly thought that that comment would correlate with neoliberal views today, mostly. All right, so which group would like to go next? Sir Robert Menzies in the front row.
Okay, we thought that the statement reflected probably a social liberal stance. We had a bit of an issue around his use of misfortune, which we felt sort of was the argument of deserving and undeserving poor, some people poor due to like
Look, it is an interesting statement because it contradicted really the actual policies he pursued once he got elected. But in 1945, the World War had just ended. Political parties worldwide were very committed to Keynesian methods. There was a strong belief that governments needed to be active in ensuring full employment and a strong economy to avoid a renewed depression and a renewal of extreme beliefs like Nazism or communism. So conservative parties like the Liberal Party had moved a very long way from a very classical liberal position in the 1920s and 30s to a more centrist position. So I agree with you, that was quite a progressive statement at the time for a Conservative Party, but it was something that certainly reflected the fact that the debate in Australia had moved a long way towards approving of significant government intervention. So he was trying to sound progressive and moderate, and obviously the term social justice implied that, although the term independence and also, I agree, misfortune implied social justice, but for those who are deserving, not those who are drunks or lazy or don't want to work or desert their wives and children. And let's not get on to Indigenous Australians. That's another black chapter. You also had a look at Alexander Downer. The things that matter or the things that batter, as he famously said in a joke.
The one with Downer, because he would probably be thought of as something insulting. And I don't think that statement by Downer is quite as good as Menzies one 50 years earlier. So, not a lot of progress.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, Alexander Downer was very much in the Conservative faction of the Liberal Party. He later became Foreign Minister in the Howard government, a long-term Foreign Minister. But at that point, he was the party leader. He reflected a very strong neoliberal perspective. But I guess what he managed to do in that particular quote was imply support for the social liberal traditions within the party, whilst at the same time using that buzzword welfare dependency, which signalled to everybody in or outside the party who was neoliberal inclined that I'm really on your side. Okay, what about Malcolm Fraser?
We thought he was definitely supporting government intervention, so maybe in the form of social liberalism. But there were undertones of that individualism creeping in with the statement about circumstances beyond his control, where we think maybe that means testing something along those lines and people that are deserving, maybe, except he's not explicitly saying that. And also when he says that the notion that deprivation is necessary for achievement, he is still making a comment that the goal is to get people to achieve.
Although he's actually saying that's wrong.
Well, no, he's saying that welfare is not going to deter them from getting more.
Yeah, look, I think that's fair enough. And I mean, he made that statement when he was still in opposition, when the Whitlam government had clearly pushed the welfare debate well to the left. So he didn't want to be seen to be a reactionary conservative. But then when he won government and held government for 8 years, his policies and the rhetoric of his government was very much about bashing welfare recipients, and that was when the term dole bludgers became very ingrained in Australian vernacular. So what he said there, certainly social liberal, but yeah, his policies in government didn't reflect it much. Although, of course, famously post-government he moved away from that conservative position and became a strong critic of the contemporary Liberal Party, at least on refugees, but on a range of issues before his death about a year ago. Okay, John Howard. Honest John. What did your group come up with?
We thought it's like close to social conservatism because it focuses on self-help, like relying on the community, developing communities and helping each other within the family and the neighborhoods, things like that, and the government shouldn't be involved. Rather, the charity or non-government should be involved to support those underprivileged communities.
Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's obviously got strong tones of neoliberalism as well. But the reference to community is interesting, and again, does reflect the fact that some neoliberals and conservatives over the years have actually expressed more interest in community involvement and interventions than the political left have. And often that is probably because a lot of political conservatives are involved in groups like Rotary clubs and the like, where they do actually provide a lot of genuine help and support for people individually or collectively in local communities and help them find work or support and that type of thing. So they often are more aware of the possibilities for community support to be important. All right, and quickly, lucky last, John Newson in the back row. That's pretty accurate. I mean, economic liberal or neoliberal, he's doesn't want to stop, does it? Oh, there we go. Very strong view, and that was reflected in the Fight Back package, which he released for the 1993 election campaign, which was a package which very much focused on cutting welfare and particularly cutting welfare to the undeserving poor, but of course he didn't win the election, so it never got implemented. I actually once ran into John Newson in a lift in a building in the city, and he was a very friendly guy, had a very nice smile, and gave a bit of an impression that he didn't really belong in politics. And shortly after that election he lost. He left politics, and ever since that time, the views he's expressed, like Malcolm Fraser, have been rather different to what he expressed when he was leader of the party. All right, so hopefully you got a good sense of where the current Liberal Party and particularly the Turnbull government is coming from. Next week we will look at the Labor Party as a contrast. And look forward to reading and marking your essays shortly. Just to let you know that we do have 6 different markers. So Simone and I will be marking a share of them, and then 4 other people externally, given we've got about 190 to mark. So if you do send us queries about have you marked my essay, I will try and respond, but the answer may often be that the external marker has got it. But the ones I mark, I'll try and give you back in the lecture next week.